Hello, everybody, again. Welcome. A lot of people are joining us from different corners of the world. Thank you again for joining. Before we dive in, a quick note, this session is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording along with any other additional resources after the webinar. We're thrilled to have you join us. Today's webinar is Disinformation, an Urgent Threat to Democracy. My name is Ben Kunde. I'm the head of international investigations here at Interfor, and I'm very excited particularly about this webinar. Number one, because it is, of course, an important topic during these times, but also growing up in former East Germany, or what was ironically called the German Democratic Republic back then, there was a lot of political disinformation that we grew up with and a lot of media control and censorship, of course. And I think our panelists today will have a lot to say about that and about the threats to democracy associated with that. So today, our panelists that are joining us are Nina Jankowicz, and I'll have Jeremy introduce her a little further later, but she's considered an expert, a leading expert in this space. We have Christopher Bakes, partner at Lewis Brisbois. He's been previously attending one of our panelists in one of our webinars as well. And we have Jeremy Hurewitz, who is a strategic advisor to Interfor International. He's also the head of Interfor Academy, which is hosting and presenting this webinar and many other webinars today. And he's also the author of a new book that just came out called Sell Like a Spy. And with that, I will hand it over to Jeremy and thank everyone for attending.
Thanks so much, Ben. And hello, everybody, wherever you are. It's great to have you with us. Really excited to host an excellent conversation. I'm saying that in advance because I'm highly confident that these two experts are going to share some incredible views. And I think we have some different perspectives amongst Chris and Nina today. So very excited to get into things. Let me do what Ben suggested, which was introduce our esteemed experts a little bit more fulsomely. Nina Jankowicz is the co-founder and CEO of the American Sunlight Project, which focuses on exposing disinformation and educating the public on its dangers. She is an internationally recognized expert on disinformation and the author of several books. Nina has advised governments, international organizations, and tech companies, and she's testified before the US Congress, the UK Parliament, and the European Parliament. Hello, Nina. Great to have you with us. Chris Bakes is a partner at the law firm Lewis Brisbois, who he has represented some of the largest companies in the world on many high-profile cases. He has previously worked on both domestic and international cases involving intellectual property and disinformation campaigns perpetuated against his clients. Chris is also a former Navy JAG officer, and he is a distinguished speaker on quite a few topics. So, Chris, great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So let's jump into things. And Nina, I want to turn to you first. And because you spend kind of all day focusing on disinformation, we're facing this enormous election right now. I wonder if you can just kind of start off with a big picture perspective for us on where we are currently at the moment with the election nearly upon us. What is your primary concern about the coming weeks, and where do things stand kind of from a macro perspective on these challenges of disinformation, and what troubles you the most?
Yeah, so basically since the beginning of the year, I have been sounding the alarm bell because I think that we are less prepared and less likely to be able to weather information threats that we are facing than we were 4 or even 8 years ago. And that's pretty stark, and I'm making such a pessimistic prognosis because of a couple of things. One, social media platforms have really rolled back their efforts to address disinformation that affects democracy, public safety, public health ahead of this election. All of the programs that were in place in 2020 that were appending information to misleading posts on social media that were potentially, pushing down the engagement that those posts could receive. All of those programs have been rolled back. Elon Musk, being in control of Twitter, now X, has given a lot of the other social media platform heads a free pass to engage in behavior they would have never dreamed of before, because Elon Musk makes everyone else look like a golden boy, right? And in addition to all of that, we researchers and journalists do not have the data access to these platforms that we used to have. We used to have access to Twitter's API, application programming interface. It now costs $42,000 a month, which for a nonprofit or an academic institution is not in our budgets, to say the least. Facebook has killed CrowdTangle, which was its service to identify trends on the platform that many researchers used. And they've replaced it with the meta content library, which most folks agree is not a suitable replacement. And Reddit as well has shut down API access, and access to TikTok and YouTube and others has always been quite difficult. And you kind of had to jump through some loopholes to get. So we not only have the social media platforms taking less action, we've got researchers who don't have data. And over the past couple of years, researchers have been anybody really studying how to fight disinformation, or even just studying trends of rumors on the internet, has been labeled by some political forces in this country as a censor. And so there's been enormous pressure on these researchers, these canaries in the coal mine, who now are unable to do much of the public interest research they were doing at this time in 2020. So we've got all those things together, and we certainly have Russia, China, and Iran, who, according to the intelligence community, are enjoying and amplifying and engaging with the polarization that we have that is, I think, really juiced up right now in the United States. A good thing to remember about foreign interference, particularly Russian interference, is that it's not making up fake news from, whole cloth. It's seizing on pre-existing fissures in our society. And we've got certainly a ton of those right now. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more detail the ways these foreign actors are seizing on those fissures as we go. But it's open season, right? We've not only got those foreign actors, but we've got folks who are using disinformation for power and for profit as we head toward the voting booth in under 2 weeks. I'll say one final thing about the federal government's response. I think because of the politicization of this topic, they are not able to be as bullish as they could have been, as they might have been, as they should be, in my opinion. And we're digging ourselves deeper and deeper into a situation where, folks are going to the ballot box without a shared set of facts. And, it's not a secret that a large part of the electorate still believes the 2020 election was stolen. And I've been in countries where there is voter fraud. I've been on election observation missions where that's a very real thing. And it takes generations to recover from those sorts of accusations. And it's not just about what we're about to experience from November to January. It's what comes after that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. It's a bleak picture, and I think you did a great job summarizing it. We'll come back to aspects of social media, and time permitting, we'll get into aspects of foreign interference. Just a reminder too that we talk for around 30 minutes or so. Sometimes we shift a little bit, and then we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. So anybody who's listening, start thinking up some questions, drop them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those. Chris, I want to invite you to comment on how you're feeling today, how you're approaching this conversation and the world of disinformation a few weeks off the election.
So I think that 5 years ago, I think what we would refer to today as disinformation, we would have simply referred to as defamation or false advertising or any other sort of deceptive, techniques that advertisers use to, falsely advertise their wares, and politicians and presenting themselves in an embellished way. I think the whole cloud has changed. We now have entire nations dedicating themselves to disruption. In preparing my comments and thoughts today, I went through the 3 areas that I thought were where we are most at risk, and where we have to be most vigilant, and where we have to be wise, and ensure that our voting public and our students in our schools are also learned and wise. They have to be well educated and informed, and not in an ideological way, but rather in that wise way that we might call Socratic and inquisitive. I think that and I'm going to draw from cases that I've actually worked on, perhaps one of the most disturbing was the use of what we would ordinarily call sophisticated platforms for defamation of perceived ideological opponents. And we found ourselves on the opposite side of a well-established university, to say the least, whose resident journalism think tank was advocating subjectivity as the preeminent standard in journalism, not objectivity. As it happened, that particular foundation used its newsletter to, we allege, defame our client. We were able to bring to the attention of the university's general counsel that their defense against the charge of defamation was going to be hurt by the fact that that very school of journalism was advocating subjectivity, not objectivity. Obviously, a subjective standard would eat up the law of defamation as it's advanced over the past several centuries or so in the Anglo-American sphere of law. So that's defamation law and the eating away and the corrosion of it with these sort of, I'll refer to them as, quote, justice-based subjective standards. The next one is the wholesale misuse of image and likeness of retailer and other websites by pirators and false advertisers from foreign countries. China, the People's Republic of China, is the most prolific host of that type of business interference. And it's murky, trying to pinpoint who exactly your defendant is. They can replicate entire websites, slightly rename the website, but still use images and likenesses of even the founders of the legitimate website. I mean, that's kind of nervy. We were able, however, recently to achieve service of process on these mystery websites by showing that they could not be located, and that for that reason, we should be able to serve them by email. Obviously, being able to serve them by email, serve them with any lawsuits by email, opens up a bright new horizon for plaintiffs who find their businesses being hijacked by these offshore actors. The third thought I share is the recent indictment by the Department of Justice of the principles of Russia Today. Russia, of course, is as mischievous as they are, and mischievous is perhaps a word that's far too light. But I want to share one of the points in the indictment that shows how Russia frames its attacks on Western thinking. And this is drawn directly from the indictment. For example, in discussing Russia Today's coverage of the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union in 2016, a Russia Today journalist recalled to an academic researcher, quote, "I asked my editor, what is Russia Today's line for Brexit? And he said, quote, anything that causes chaos is Russia Today's line." The other problem we face is that people feel that they have had there's a bit of a lifesaver in some of these fact-checking enterprises. Actually, you have to double-check your fact-checkers, because the fact-checkers themselves are often nonprofits who can be influenced heavily by donors and donor priorities. So, and that brings me to sort of my wrap-up first point is an educated public is the best guard against this. And as I share often, we all need to be evangelists of wisdom and learning, and we need to elevate the priorities of Western culture and civilization. And we need to be assertive in making those points, and we need to be unashamed, because the enemies are all around us. And so I think that that to me is wisdom and learning should be one of the takeaways from my thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris. And I think that really sets the table for us, thinking about some of the aspects of corporate malfeasance and disinformation that maybe we can return to in a moment. And, obviously Nina's organization does the work that I think you're referring to in part of educating the public. So I think we all have a role in that. And that's a great point there. One thing I wanted to also, think about is being proactive about some of these threats, some of the disinformation on the corporate side. Our threat monitoring side of Interfor International's business is probably the most rapidly growing part of our business as these threats of disinformation proliferate against corporate clients. So keeping an eye on the timing a little bit too, I might want to return to some of the corporate side of things. But what I really want to jump into, and I'm dying to talk to you guys about as a kind of ex-journalist, someone who still writes and someone who cares deeply about kind of the American style of objective journalism. And Chris, you were just referring to that. As someone who does care about that, I've been deeply concerned about the erosion of, this important safeguard on society. Specifically, we've seen in the Middle East the way foreign desks, and I'm thinking specifically at the moment about the Washington Post and how it's come out that a huge part of their foreign desk were previous Al Jazeera reporters. Those of us who know a little bit about the conflict have been rather shocked the way the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications overseas as well have just revealed a total bias in covering the conflict. And you'll see something where, a bunch of months ago, a rocket hit a hospital in Gaza. Before anything could even be discussed, it was, the Israelis were blamed. And it turned out a few days later, it was very clear that it was a rocket, I believe, from Islamic Jihad or another faction there. And there was a correction issued, but by then, the false information was out there, and most people didn't see the correction. And it brings to mind that old saying that I might not get it right, but the truth, the lie is halfway around the world before the truth even gets its pants on. So I'm deeply concerned about the erosion of this kind of objective style of journalism, and I would like to ask you, Nina, about your thoughts on the moment in American journalism and rising to the challenge of disinformation, and invite you to comment on anything I just said broadly there, and then we'll go to Chris.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I have seen a lot of outlets fall down in the face of truth while they try to be objective as well, to kind of counter what you're saying. So for instance, I know you intended to kind of talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to bring it up now. So sorry for ruining your show flow.
It's a conversation.
Those who may know a little bit about my background know that in 2022, I was appointed to lead an effort within the Department of Homeland Security called the Disinformation Governance Board. The way that DHS rolled out that effort, which was meant to bring together different parts of DHS and coordinate policy on responding to disinformation, protecting our fundamental rights and freedoms, et cetera, was very opaque. And as a result, folks on the far right, especially led by Fox News, were making up lies about me, about the board, about what we were intending to do, calling us a ministry of truth. And folks on what you might call the left side of the spectrum, media outlets on the left side of the spectrum, were barely covering it at all because they couldn't get DHS on record. DHS was not responding to requests for comment, which was not what I advised them to do. But they couldn't get DHS on record. They had nothing to go off of. And so they just weren't covering it. And then when they did, even the New York Times, even, outlets that typically might do a good job on this were saying there were widespread concerns about DHS and this Disinformation Governance Board, which frankly was not true. There were made up allegations about what the board was doing, but in attempting to kind of be objective and be both sidesy there, what they did was actually elevate the falsehoods about the board. So I've seen this go both ways. Another great example is during the invasion of Crimea, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, journalists on the ground there were getting quotes from the little green men from Russia, the military men without insignia who were there taking over the peninsula, getting quotes from folks that the Russians had kind of handed to them on a plate and said, oh, these local citizens might be interesting for you to talk to, in an effort, again, to be objective in their journalism, when, I mean, it's pretty clear when a sovereign peninsula of one country is being taken over by another country, some sources might be tainted, right? And so I think when we're dealing with disinformation and these kind of lies that are told for power and for profit. I think objectivity is sometimes a foil that the liars are using in order to kind of ensure that there is a balance in the lies that they're telling and putting that on the same pedestal as the truth. And I do worry about that. I recognize it's not an answer to your question about how we rise to the occasion, but I think context and nuance are incredibly, incredibly important. And having done some work in open source investigations myself, certainly the hospital bombing that you mentioned was a real failure of journalism. And I think it's less about objectivity and more about the fact that all of these outlets were rushing to be the first to report. And that, I think, is a real problem.
Yeah, those are great points, and it's the rush and it's the editorial priorities that what people choose to write about, and then it's the bias within that can be problematic. Before I get to you, Chris, I just want to drill down a little bit further, Nina, and ask, do you know about, are journalism schools confronting this? Are some of the newsrooms like the Times or other bigger newspapers, are they doing any on-the-job training? Because I think that feels needed at the moment, and I'm curious if you could give me a brief reply there, and then I'll turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, I think there's been some reckoning, certainly since 2014 and the Crimea example that I gave, where newsrooms are trying to grapple with this moving target that is disinformation and how you approach that in an objective manner without elevating the lies to the same part of the truth. But to give one other example as well, somebody who very much believes that there is no such thing as objective journalism anymore, Taylor Lorenz, has just very famously left the Post after having been at the Times and the Post covering the internet because she felt that she was being unfairly criticized for putting herself too much into the story, and she's going to continue to do journalism that is now on her own Substack that she's fully in control of. So I think we're seeing a real paradigm shift here, and that I think Taylor does great journalism. So I don't know where to come down on that, but I think there's a conversation actively being had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I love, the new school of new journalism. I love, gonzo journalism. I love the whole Hunter S. Thompson thing. But when I pick up the Times or the Washington Post, I want objective, just the facts. Chris, what are your thoughts on the state of American journalism and disinformation at the moment?
I think that it's almost a case of the toothpaste being out of the tube and how do we put it back in? Because I think that we've had decades of disinformation even in our own classrooms. And I share the thought, I happen to be a baby boomer, born between 1946 and 1964. Where within that I am is up to you all to guess. But when I was, and I had happened to have been taught by clergy, teaching sisters, priests, and a few lay people throughout my education. So that's 20 school years of that form of teaching. Throughout my time, particularly in high school and college and law school, we never knew a teacher or professor's politics. It was taboo. In fact, if we did happen to know, on the rare occasion, their politics, we classified that person as a bit of a nut because something inappropriate was encroaching into our learning. We were not being taught how to be wise or reflective people, but we were being taught how to think by that rare professor. And I had just one, thankfully. I think that we, as well, for those of us that are from that baby boomer generation who were taught by those who fought the war, we were taught and raised by those who landed on the Normandy beaches. And if you went to these sorts of schools that I went to, you were taught by those who had actually been prisoners of war or in other concentration camps by the tripartite dictators of the time, Stalin, Mao, and Hitler. I happen to have been taught by three. So with that type of awareness, that couldn't help but to seep into our learning and to have this acute awareness of the need for objectivity and a sort of learning that was consistent with the lessons that we had just learned. And the lessons that we had just learned, that when dictators go on the march, take them seriously, because if you don't, you're going to have to pay later. And Nowadays, we have all kinds of ways that the dictators are again on the march, despite warnings by those of my generation saying this looks a lot like 1939. So I think that this goes to my point about what we have to do is to be very organic in our re-education, well, to use a perhaps controversial term, but to educate our young people and the kids in our own lives about the importance of objectivity, the importance of learning, the importance of wisdom, and the importance of listening to those who lived through these times and therefore have something quite relevant to say. And when I was in a deposition recently where we had, off-record conversations with a few of the attorneys, and I happened to mention, because of course the topic was, slightly political, Hitler and Stalin. One of the lawyers didn't know who Stalin was. Certainly knew Hitler, but didn't know Stalin. I could only think to myself, what sort of education led you to me today that I am hearing you not knowing who Stalin is? So excellence in education, the taboo, attaching a taboo to those of our teachers who insert their politics into the schools, and an awareness that, Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian civilization is a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
And we'd better promote it or we're going to lose it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about one of the best ways to combat disinformation is to, have an educated public. Keeping an eye on the timing here, I really want to ask a little bit further about social media. And Nina, I want to turn this over to you. I'd like to hear from you about, what steps can be taken. And I'll get to you, Chris, about it too, because I'd like to hear your views on the regulatory aspects of social media, what we should consider. But Nina, you also have a very personal story when it's come to being the victim of disinformation, one that you've written about in The Atlantic, one that you've been very vocal about, and I commend you for that. And you've really been through some difficult things. If you wouldn't mind kind of sharing that experience with the audience and then sharing your views on social media, we'd appreciate that. And let's keep an eye on the clock too, because we are getting some cool questions in here. But this is such an important and relevant story. I'd be so grateful if you'd share it, Nina.
Yeah, absolutely. So I gave you kind of the précis before. What I didn't talk about was what happened as a result of the lies that were told about me. I was on Fox News every hour on the hour for weeks on end. And then even after I resigned from DHS, still almost every week for the remainder of 2022. Every time that I was on Fox News, it would drive a huge wave of online harassment. There was also harassment that originated online. And this was everything from, gendered and sexualized insults to credible threats against me and my family. At the time that the Disinformation Governance Board was announced, I was pregnant, just about to become a mom. So a time that should have been very, peaceful and happy was fraught with stress. People were talking about my unborn child. I got a cyber stalker who demanded to see my child because he didn't believe that he was real. And then even a year after I resigned, I found out then that I had been depicted in deepfake pornography or non-consensual AI-generated intimate imagery. And I had studied online abuse and disinformation for a long time before all of this happened to me. So ironically, I was more prepared for it than I think the normal victim of these attacks are. But that doesn't make it any less difficult. And it changes how you move around in the world when you've been doxxed, when people have put you into these intimate images for thousands and thousands of people to see, or when you're ridiculed on a personal level on the largest cable news network in the country. And those effects that happen online have offline effects, I think, is the main thing for everyone to understand. There tends to be this assessment that online and offline are different things, but we all know now, especially after the pandemic, that the continuum, it's not even a continuum anymore. We are having this event online right now. I'm going to go and continue to work from my home remotely with my remote team, right? The internet is an important part of our lives. And the way that the social media platforms are approaching abuse, harassment, deepfake pornography, and frankly, disinformation as well, is frankly really disturbing to me, because it is empowering some people in the name of free speech, and then the folks that they are targeting have to make the decision of, are they going to put their safety and their family and their livelihoods at risk to continue speaking out, or are they going to remove themselves from the public sphere entirely? And to get to your question about regulation, I mean, I don't think we'll see in the United States a regulatory regime like they have in the UK or Australia or even the EU that has protections for online safety for protected groups. I just don't think that we're going to see that. But what I do think that we need is oversight and transparency mechanisms that allow the platforms to be held to account. And ideally, what I believe that should look like is a federal commission on the internet, just like we've got, the FCC, we've got the FTC, we've got the FAA, that would act as a neutral clearinghouse, making sure that those who have access to this data are legitimate individuals, that they have good data stewardship, that they're using it for public interest research purposes. And then from there, we've got a shared set of facts that we can talk about. Here's actually what's going on the platform. Here's how these platforms are making business decisions about what content to surface in the algorithms and what to suppress, because the most engaging content online is the most enraging content. There's a reason that, falsehoods about me that made people really angry about their freedom of speech went so viral, but they had enormous consequences for my life that can't be put back in the bottle right now. I could go on, but I do think that in general, we've seen a dereliction of duty from the platforms, and we've seen a dereliction of duty from Congress in waiting so many years to pass a single law about anything related to tech regulation at the federal level. I'm sure many of your listeners know that there is no federal level legislation against non-consensual AI-generated intimate imagery. There's some that exist on the state level, but it's a real uphill battle, and there's 2 bills being considered in Congress right now that are probably not going to get passed before the end of the 118th, which, again, it is just a real, it's a shame, and it is frankly putting women and girls in this country at continued risk for reasons that I just cannot fathom or understand. It should be something that everyone agrees on, and indeed both of those bills have bipartisan co-sponsorship, and yet our Congress can't get it done. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Nina. I know how deeply frustrating that is for you. The story of what you've been through is deeply moving, and I think you do a very eloquent job as an advocate, having lived that example. I enjoyed that piece in The Atlantic you wrote very much. We've just shared that in the chat. I encourage everybody to read it. Chris, I want to turn the floor over to you. I know that you don't specifically focus in your practice on the tech regulations and all that, but I know your intellectual interests and knowledge of the law are quite wide. So I want to invite you to comment on, what you think should be done in the U.S. in terms of regulating social media. I know you've also familiarized yourself with Nina's case, and I think you might even have some thoughts on legal repercussions for this type of thing. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
So to go to your first point about what the social media platforms can do, or what any of the larger platforms can do, and including YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, TikTok. Of course, TikTok is almost beyond our jurisdiction, but hopefully we'll be able to resolve that soon. Many people are not aware that the congressionally enacted Communications Decency Act contains a provision, section colloquially referred to as Section 230, that absolves platforms of liability for content that they don't themselves produce. And of course, most of those platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and the others, do not produce their own content, or produce very little of their own content, meaning that everything you see is subject to this exemption for platform liability. The beauty of a liability system is that it puts the onus on the responsible actor to take steps to protect themselves against liability, meaning that if that provision of the Communications Decency Act was repealed or modified, and the burden was placed on platforms like YouTube or Instagram to take responsibility for the content they publish, then that, I think, would mark a sea change in how those platforms themselves handle this kind of content. A newspaper does not get to say, well, that's not our content, we're just quoting. If a newspaper or TV outlet repeats a defamatory comment, they've repeated the tort. They become liable. That is completely absent on the online platform side. And I think that places the platforms at a tremendous advantage over just about anyone.
Yeah.
And we have had instances where we could not proceed against a platform specifically because of the Communications Decency Act, regardless of the extreme falsehood of the comment. There are other things that you can do. For example, if you can reach out to that to the speaker itself and get some kind, structure a lawsuit, sue, and get an order that you can then present to the platform. In other words, by this order, you're commanded to remove that content because it's known to be false. But that's an extremely circuitous, costly, and uncertain way to handle this. So I am a proponent of a major adjustment to the Communications Decency Act and that Section 230. It was designed at a time that the internet was a new thing, fledgling, and it's not that anymore.
Yeah.
As to Nina's horrible ordeal, which I find, personally shocking, that even could happen, or that we have in our society people with not only the wherewithal, but the willingness to dedicate themselves to that type of, awful imagery is, just tragic. The thought I have shared, though, in California, there is Civil Code Section 1133, which does protect image and likeness. Now, it may be that you're dealing with somebody that has the perpetrator has maybe a penny to their name, but it at least would give you a court order to take to the platform. If you were to sue the perpetrator, it would be a civil suit. If you were to sue the perpetrator and get a court order, then that is something that you could present to the platform, as assuming that the judge would allow you to word the order in a way that reaches whatever is being displayed. There are ways, but California's image and likeness statute is not a national statute, but it does work in California. And if the California courts have jurisdiction and you can sue in California, then that to me is an appropriate outcome.
Thanks, Chris. Nina, I want to invite you to comment on anything that was just shared there. And also, amongst the questions that were being asked here, someone's referring to the new book by Yuval Noah Harari, his book on AI, and he advocates the prohibition of bots, and being able to pass as humans, and then making platforms liable for misinformation or harmful information they're sharing through their algorithms. I think that both of you, I'm sensing, would kind of be in favor of that. But Nina, I just wanted to offer you a chance of maybe not a weighing in on anything that Chris just said or any of that. And got one more important question too. We're at this 5-minute mark before we sign off.
Okay. Well, let me try to be quick with that. I mean, I think 230 is a really complicated area. I think it needs to be amended, but I don't think it should be abolished entirely. And my reasoning for that is there have been similar laws passed in other countries, including in Germany, the NetzDG law, which makes platforms liable for manifestly illegal content that is posted on them and requires them to take down that content within 24 to 48 hours of being notified that it's on there. And it's since been amended, but the initial kind of existence of that law actually increased the amount of posts that were taken down that weren't responsive to illegalities. There was a lot of AI moderation happening, classifiers that were misattributed to certain posts, and that meant that minorities ended up getting their speech repressed because of that over moderation by the platforms. And so I think we need to proceed with caution there. I would much prefer to see oversight and transparency regulation instituted before we made changes to Section 230, but I do think it absolves platforms of too much liability for the really horrible things that they amplify and provide platforms for. So I can't get into all the details with the short amount of time we have left. But regarding banning bots and making platforms liable for misinformation, interestingly, we at the American Sunlight Project just released a report about 2 weeks ago that uncovered a vast bot network on X. Some of the accounts on there were around for more than a decade. One even was around for 15 years. We called them sleeper agents because they sprung into action around key moments, elections, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, etc. And they all retweet Russian propaganda, overt Russian propaganda within 60 seconds. So clear evidence of automation there. There are good uses for bots. We all probably follow bots that we don't know about. There are bots that, I always like to talk about the bots that notify us when somebody edits a member of Congress's Wikipedia page from within Capitol Hill. That's like a public service, right? So I think banning all bots is probably a stroke too far. But I do think, they do contribute to the inorganic amplification and kind of astroturfing, as we call it, of certain platforms. Twitter has become really susceptible to this. And so I think understanding what accounts are bots, or at least labeling them, is a good thing. Unfortunately, some of the accounts, including those in our sleeper agent network, use a combination of inorganic, amplification through code, bots, and then some human control behind them. So it's not always super simple. With misinformation, absolutely, I would not agree with making platforms liable for misinformation. The scale is just way too big. And I think that's where we get back to Chris's point about education and empowering people to better navigate today's information environment. It's about information literacy. It's not just what's good and bad. It's about empowering people to be comfortable in the gray area and the nuance. And that's so important in this day and age. Everything is not black and white. And if I could share one tip, because you asked me this in the beginning, for folks looking to spot misinformation or disinformation, if it's making you emotional, you're probably being manipulated. The platforms incentivize that sort of content, and disinformers absolutely understand that to make you angry, to make you elated, to make you upset is more likely to make you engaged. So just remember that as we head toward November 5th here.
Yeah, we did chat about that, and we do have a question about that. And we won't have to cut off at exactly 12:45, but we try to stick to that because everybody has very busy lives. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you in just a moment for maybe a closing thought, which I'll ask you to keep brief. But I want to give you the floor just for one more minute, Nina, to continue in the same vein, because a member of the audience was asking about practical solutions for identifying misinformation. I don't know if you just covered it there, but how do you identify false statements? I definitely heard you about, if you're feeling emotional, you could be manipulated, but anything else you'd like to share in terms of practical advice in that sense, better Google searches, whatever you'd like to share in a moment?
Sure. Yeah. So when you feel that spidey sense tingling, I might be being manipulated, the first thing to do is stop, walk away. So much of this is passive engagement or passive amplification that we're kind of trained to do by these algorithms. Separate yourself from your device. If you're still thinking about it in a little bit, come back, investigate the source, find different coverage, see if other outlets are reporting the same thing in a different way or the same way. And then you can try to trace those claims either by putting a quote from the article into Google, seeing if it got picked up on a wire service, or doing a reverse image search and seeing if images have been misattributed. There's even some plugins that can detect AI editing now as well. It's not as hard as it sounds. So that's stop, investigate, find better coverage, trace claims, sift, to use that mnemonic. And I think that, again, just encourages more deliberate consumption and amplification of the things that we're engaging with online.
That's really helpful. Chris, we're at the finish line here. Before I wrap things up, if there's any kind of burning idea that you'd like to share in a minute or two, or closing thoughts as we, steamroll to this very momentous election, anything you'd like to share, the floor is yours.
So I guess my thought would be anytime that I read something online and begin to formulate an opinion, if it's not something I've read before, I double source and triple source. And I find that really evens out the information playing field, because I listened, I try to avoid Fox and MSNBC only because they're, I find them just to be a little too much. But I find that if you go to places like, The Atlantic or National Review or places that dot sort of our vast center, be it center right or center left, I think that that's the way to educate yourself and to sort of inoculate your mind against these, mind worms.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I wish that we could all do that. This has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Nina and Chris for being with us today. I know I've learned a lot. I could continue this conversation for quite a bit longer. Thanks, Ben, for getting us started. Appreciate everyone who's attended today. All of you will be receiving an email with a recording of today's discussion if you want to circle back. There's a lot to unpack there. And please be on the lookout next month for a really interesting and rather novel webinar from Interfor Academy that is going to be, first time we're talking about it here, on the phenomenon of unexplained aerial phenomenons and the way that the U.S. government is finally actually looking at this and taking it from the realm of kind of conspiracy theorists to evaluate what's going on here. We're going to talk about that a little bit with an amazing leading expert, the journalist Ralph Blumenthal, and we'll talk about what a corporate perspective might look like. How do you risk manage for such a crazy thing? So it should be fun. It should be interesting. Thanks again, Chris and Nina. Really appreciate you guys. What a great discussion. Please have a look at the Interfor Academy page to get a better sense of who we are and what we're doing. And I look forward to being with you all next month.